The USS Sea Lion II, a Palau-class submarine, was on her third war patrol in the Pacific. Commissioned in March of 1944, the vessel and her crew had already proven their worth by sinking multiple Japanese vessels off the coast of China and Korea. At 2:20 a.m. on November 21st, the submarine made radar contact with a Japanese formation moving through the Formosa Strait. The vessels, 2 cruisers, 2 battleships, and 3 destroyer escorts, were moving at a speed of approximately 16 knots and were not zigzagging. Although the crew aboard Sea Lion did not know it yet, they were about to engage Admiral Takeo Kurita's First Strike Force, fresh out of Brunei. Nonetheless, Sea Lion's crew quickly went into battle formations to face the enemy head-on. Their first target was Kongo, also known as the Indestructible Diamond, one of the Imperial Navy's most heavily armed and armored battleships. The odds were against Sea Lion II, but her crew was confident they could pull it off. The United States Navy's Palau-class submarines were an improved version of the earlier Gato-class submarines. Named after the Palau half-beak fish species, the class was introduced in early 1943. USS Sea Lion II, the second American vessel to bear the moniker, was named after the species of large-eared seals native to the Pacific Ocean. Her keel was laid down on February 25th by the renowned Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and she was launched on October 31st, sponsored by Vice Admiral Emery Land and his wife. The second Sea Lion was officially commissioned 5 months later, with Lieutenant Commander Eli T. Reich at the helm. The Palau-class diesel-electric submarine had a length of 311 feet, a beam of 27 feet, and a maximum draft of 16 feet. She displaced 1,526 long tons when surfaced and 2,463 tons when submerged. Powered by 4 General Motors Model 16278A V16 diesel engines, 4 high-speed GE electric motors, and 2 cell Sargo batteries, USS Sea Lion II could achieve speeds of 20.25 knots on the surface and 8.75 knots when fully submerged. In addition, the submarine boasted a maximum range of over 11,000 nautical miles at a speed of over 10 knots. The submarine had a complement of 10 officers and over 70 enlisted men, and was armed with 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 tubes forward and 4 aft, carrying a total of 24 torpedoes. And to counter enemy aircraft, she was armed with a 5-inch 25 caliber deck gun, Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft guns, and Bofors 40mm guns. Sea Lion II engaged Japanese vessels for the first time on June 23, 1944, after arriving at the Osumi Gunto Island Group located south of Kyushu. However, she did not score any hits and had to maneuver to escape the enemy's depth charges. The vessel then joined another hunting party of submarines and approached the Korean peninsula to track down Japanese ships. On June 28th, she claimed her first victim, after she sank the naval transport Sansei Maru off the shores of Tsushima Island. 2 days later, the submarine used her deck guns for the first time to sink a sampan in the Korean archipelago. Sea Lion II then made her way to the coast of China to patrol Shanghai, where she intercepted a convoy south of the Four Sisters Islands on July 6th. The crew commenced the torpedo attack at approximately 4:50 in the morning, and within minutes, the Setsuzan Maru had been dispatched to the depths, causing the convoy to disperse. At 6 a.m., an Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer and aircraft arrived to hunt down Sea Lion II, which failed to sink the enemy vessel despite firing several torpedoes. The chase persisted until late in the evening, but Sea Lion emerged unscathed. On July 11th, the determined American crew savored victory once again, having sunk 2 freighters, Suksi Maru II and Taian Maru II. Sea Lion II embarked on her second war patrol alongside USS Growler and Pomponido on August 17, 1944. The Wolf ventured into the South China Sea, where they encountered a Japanese convoy on the night of August 30th. The submarines inflicted severe damage on the Riko Maru tanker with surface fire, but they were engaged by the deck guns of other Japanese vessels. Sea Lion II disengaged the convoy and later counterattacked, sinking the mine layer Shirataka. She then returned to Saipan to be refueled and resupplied. On September 7th, the Palau-class submarine rejoined her attack group and approached the Balintang Channel, where they decimated an enemy convoy bound for the island of Formosa. A destroyer, a tanker, and a transport ship were set ablaze by the combined fire of torpedoes and deck guns. Soon, however, Sea Lion II and her hunting party inadvertently partook in one of the most tragic blue-on-blue incidents of the war when they sank Rakyo Maru and Kachidoki Maru. These two Japanese vessels were transporting over 2,220 Australian and British prisoners of war, and it's estimated that over 1,600 of them perished. Upon realizing their tragic error, the U.S. Navy submarines surfaced and managed to rescue over 150 Allied POWs. The remaining 500 survivors were later picked up by Japanese Navy destroyers and transported to mainland Japan. Sea Lion II then returned to Pearl Harbor and departed a few days later in the company of USS Keat. She was about to face the greatest threat to her entire submarine career. USS Sea Lion II and Keat returned to the familiar waters of the East China Sea in late October of 1944. Although the pair tracked down several convoys, they refrained from engaging any near Shanghai. At 2:20 a.m. on November 21st, Sea Lion II established radar contact with the Japanese formation, traveling through the Formosa Strait at about 16 knots. Unbeknownst to Sea Lion II and her task force, they were about to confront Admiral Takeo Kurita's first strike force, which had narrowly escaped a daring Allied air raid on Brunei Island. The flagship of Kurita's fleet was Kongo, meaning indestructible diamond, named after the formidable Mount Kongo in Japan's Osaka Prefecture. As the lead ship of the Kongo-class battleships, Kongo was the most active vessel in the Imperial Navy. With a displacement of over 36,600 tons, she was heavily armed. Her primary armament consisted of 8 14-inch main guns distributed across 4 large turrets in a forward and aft configuration, while her secondary armament included 16 6-inch and 8 3-inch guns, along with an additional 8 21-inch torpedo tubes. Kongo was also well armored, boasting a main armor belt that was 8 inches thick and a deck that was nearly 3 inches thick. Moreover, the faces of the main turrets were protected by 9-inch thick armor. Soon, her convoy made contact with Sea Lion II and her hunting party. Upon establishing radar contact with the Japanese formation, Sea Lion II's task force grasped the magnitude of the situation before them. There were 2 battleships and 2 cruisers. Then, at around 2:40 a.m., 3 additional ships showed up. The challenge was on, and the U.S. Navy task force adopted battle formations, with Sea Lion II spearheading the assault. Admiral Kurita had instructed his ships to maintain a speed of over 17 knots without zigzagging, relying on a strategic minefield that stretched from north of Formosa along the Ryukyu Islands to Honshu. Believed to be impenetrable for any American vessel, including submarines, the minefield was of little concern to Sea Lion and her hunting party. At approximately 2:55 a.m., Sea Lion fired 6 torpedoes at the second ship in the formation. 3 minutes later, she fired 3 torpedoes toward one of the battleships. The crew then witnessed 3 explosions from the first salvo, confirming the successful sinking of the destroyer Yurikaze. As Sea Lion maneuvered for another salvo, the crew heard the impact from the second set of torpedoes, which had struck one battleship and dented its armor belt. It was Kongo. Remarkably, Sea Lion's crew captured the attack's audio, using a sound recorder left behind by a CBS war correspondent. The submarine then reloaded as Admiral Kurita's task force began zigzagging to evade incoming torpedoes. Nevertheless, the U.S. Navy submarines relentlessly maintained pressure and strategically pursued their quarry. There was no way out. Sea Lion's crew initially believed they had only dented Kongo's thick armor, but the damage inflicted was far more severe, and the formidable vessel began flooding at an alarming rate. It was 3:10 a.m., and Kongo's crew knew the end was imminent. Even so, the crew and the rest of Kurida's force continued to sail following their Bushido principles, dropping depth charges and employing every possible tactic to destroy the enemy pursuing them. At 4:50 a.m., Kurida's task force split into two groups to distract the submarines. Sea Lion went after the slower group, which quickly lagged behind due to Kongo's flooding. The battleship's speed gradually diminished until she was left motionless in the water. Then, at 5:24 a.m., Kongo's magazine exploded, and the ship swiftly vanished beneath the waves. Over 1,200 crew members perished, including Vice Admiral Ugaki. Sea Lion's Commander Reich, a proud Irish Catholic, then yelled, quote, "Oh, the luck of the Irish." The Buckley-class destroyer escorts were smaller and cheaper alternatives to standard U.S. Navy destroyers. However, they were outstanding vessels when it came to anti-submarine warfare and escort duties, and USS England was one of them. Armed with the powerful British-designed 24-barrel Hedgehog motor, England was equipped with all the essential features that made her an excellent submarine hunter, despite her size and armament compared to larger battleships. In a remarkable and historic run, the tiny warship would excel at sinking enemy submarines in waters infested by Japanese vessels during a short but fruitful hunting season. And her record remains unbroken almost 80 years later. USS England was launched in September of 1943 at the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation shipyard in San Francisco, sponsored by Mrs. H.B. England, the mother of Ensign John C. England, who lost his life aboard the battleship USS Oklahoma during the attack on Pearl Harbor. She was commissioned on December 10, 1943, and sent to the Pacific after going over basic sea trials. Buckley-class destroyer escorts were designed for anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort, and were powered by two Foster Wheeler Express D water tube boilers, two GE steam turbines of 13,500 horsepower, and two generators with 12,000 horsepower. Their maximum speed was 24 knots, and their estimated range was 5,500 miles at 15 knots. Plus, the class had a capacity for over 350 tons of oil. Fully loaded, a Buckley-class destroyer escort could displace a weight of 1,740 tons and had a length of 306 feet, a beam of 36 feet, and a draft of 11 feet. USS England was armed with three 3-inch guns, one triple bank of 21-inch torpedoes, 8 side-throwing K-gun depth charge projectors, one Mark 10 Hedgehog anti-submarine motor, and 2 stern depth charge racks. The British-designed 24-barrel Hedgehog motor fired an elliptical spread of 24 ASW projectiles up to 300 yards ahead of the ship. Samuel J. Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, said that, quote, "The projectiles would fire in a sequence, so they would all impact the water at the same time. Unlike standard depth charges, which had hydrostatic fuses, each Hedgehog projectile had a contact fuse that detonated on impact with the submarine." Cox notes that this system had several advantages. First, it was immediately evident if the attack had been successful. If the projectiles made contact, there had to be an explosion. In addition, enemy submarines could not detect the Hedgehog until it was too late to maneuver, and she could be reloaded in 3 minutes. England arrived at Espiritu Santo in Sumner Province, Vanuatu, on March 12, 1944, from a long voyage in which she traversed Pearl Harbor, Funafuti, and the captured island of Guadalcanal. During the month of April, she conducted escort missions between the 3 locations and the Marshall Islands. The crew was eager for action, as the escort duties had been uneventful. No Japanese vessel or submarine was sighted during the operations. Finally, on May 13, 1944, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific intercepted and decoded a message from the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-16. I-16 had sent a final radio transmission before departing Truk without realizing her doom was near. The message contained details about a rice delivery for Imperial Army troops stationed at Buin on Bougainville Island, and the expected arrival at the Solomon Islands was May 22nd after 10 p.m. Commander Hamilton Haynes, the head of Escort Division 39 based at Tulagi, immediately ordered a 3-ship hunter-killer task force to get rid of the submarine before it arrived at its destination. The epic hunting saga of USS England began on May 18th, when Escort Division 39, comprising USS Robbie and USS George, was dispatched alongside USS England from Escort Division 40 to intercept the hostile submarine. England was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton, and the 3 destroyer escorts departed Purvis Bay on May 18, 1944, with Commander Haynes aboard USS George as an officer in tactical command. Later that day, the task force learned that the Japanese had established a line of 7 submarines between New Guinea and the Central Pacific Caroline Islands to draw American forces in and destroy them in one decisive battle. The strategy was part of Operation Ago. Most of the orders and specific positions radioed by the Japanese Sixth Fleet were intercepted by the U.S. Navy and shared with the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area Estimates Section. Meanwhile, USS England and the 2 escort destroyers were hunting their prey. On May 19th, Allied aircraft sighted I-16 surfacing north of Bougainville, and at 1:35 p.m., the escorts detected the submarine with a sonar sweep. England then went into action and launched 2 Hedgehog attacks. I-16 evaded them, but a third one hit. Even so, the seasoned Japanese crew kept conducting evasive maneuvers, and a 4th Hedgehog failed to hit the target. Finally, the submarine's luck ran out during the 5th run. 5 solid hits led to a massive underwater explosion at around 2:35 p.m. In a 1980 article from Proceedings magazine, Captain John Williamson, England's executive officer, recalled, quote, "England's fantail was lifted a full 6 inches, then plopped heavily back into the water. We had, with cataclysmic certainty, heard the last of one Japanese submarine. Sobered and more than taken aback by that final blast, we no longer felt like cheering. But we did stand a little straighter." Half an hour later, debris began surfacing from the ocean. I-16 was lost with all her crew, but there was no time to celebrate. The 7 submarines from Operation Ago had departed Saipan, and there was work to do. During the night of May 22nd, the 3 escort destroyers detected submarine RO-106 when it surfaced. USS George spotted the enemy vessel on the surface and illuminated her with her searchlight. RO-106 had problems with her radar and was caught off guard. The submarine immediately went into a dive and tried to escape, but England and Robbie immediately launched Hedgehogs, missing every time. The 3 U.S. Navy ships hunted down the enemy submarine for over 20 minutes before she was picked up by the radar once again. This time, the Japanese tried to counterattack and turned directly in England's direction to launch her torpedoes. Nevertheless, USS England was faster and scored 3 hits before the enemy was within range. RO-106 then went to the depths with all 49 hands. On May 23rd, RO-104 became England's 3rd prey. The submarine was at her assigned station when she was sighted about 250 nautical miles north-northwest of Cavieng in New Ireland. USS Robbie gained radar contact at around 6 a.m., and so did RO-104, which quickly vanished into the sea. A cat-and-mouse chase followed, with the 3 Buckleys conducting Hedgehog attacks to sink the Japanese submarine. Even so, RO-104 maneuvered efficiently, avoiding more than 5 attacks and jamming the sonars of the ships with tuned sound impulses. 2 hours later, the hunt ended when England hit the target with 12 projectiles from her 2nd Hedgehog attack. A colossal underwater explosion followed, signaling that RO-104 and her crew of 58 were gone. USS England was on a streak, and there was still much more to come. Soon after sinking another submarine, RO-116, on May 24th, the trio of Buckley escort destroyers sailed at full speed towards Seidler Harbor in Manus Island, where Ruby gained radar contact on RO-108, commanded by Lieutenant Kenichi Obari. The submarine was on her 5th patrol and had a crew with plenty of naval experience. Like her sisters, RO-108 submerged and began evasive maneuvers to escape from the ships after spotting them. USS Robbie almost scored a direct hit, but England quickly followed with an accurate Hedgehog launch and scored 6 projectiles on the enemy submarine. The underwater explosion and the debris that surfaced minutes later signaled that USS England had sunk her 4th Japanese submarine, this time with 53 crewmen on board. However, The task force quickly returned to the hunting grounds of the Pacific on May 30th, 1944. The three Buckleys joined a larger task force of former destroyers, and during the night of May 31st, gained radar contact on RO-105. The hunting continued well into the early morning. RO-105 used every imaginable trick to run away, but she was cornered by a superior force. Several destroyers attempted to strike her down, but kept failing. Then, when it was finally England's turn, her crew was ready to keep the streak going. At one point during the hunt, Commander Haynes said, quote, "Oh hell, go ahead, England," and she did. Minutes later, RO-105 was lost with all her crew. USS England would earn 10 battle stars for her service in the Pacific, before being attacked by Japanese aircraft in Okinawa in May of 1945. Over 37 crewmen were lost, and the ship was severely damaged. She was then scrapped in 1946 after the war ended. Even so, USS England still keeps the record for most submarines sunk by a single ship to this very day, and her 6-submarine streak over 12 days remains unparalleled. A sister ship in flames, its German assailant lurking in the shadows, and time slipping away in the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. In the midst of chaos, HMCS Haida embarked on a daring World War II rescue operation that would define its legacy. At the helm was Captain DeWolf, known as Hardover Harry, as strong and resilient as the Canadian destroyer he commanded. With the lives of comrades hanging in the balance and the dark silhouette of enemy vessels on the horizon, he faced an unthinkable choice: continue the rescue, risking an attack from more German vessels, or cease the operation, leaving behind friends and allies. The ship would make a decision it would ultimately come to regret, one that would later send it on a merciless rampage of revenge for the rest of the war. Originating in design studies from the mid-1930s, the Tribal, or Afridi class, was initially envisioned as a light fleet cruiser. Yet, as the Japanese, Italian, and German navies unveiled innovative designs, the Tribal soon adapted into agile destroyers. Envisioned to be larger in stature, its designers prioritized guns over torpedoes more than their predecessors, emphasizing anti-ship warfare, but still upholding potent anti-aircraft defenses. As such, housing a crew of nearly 190 men, the Tribal class towered over the standard destroyers of their era, stretching to about 377 feet and displacing up to 2,519 tons when fully laden. Of the 27 Tribal-class vessels crafted, 16 sailed for the Royal Navy, 3 for the Australian Navy, and 8 bore the Canadian flag. Soon after their introduction, these destroyers showcased their prowess across World War II's vast naval theaters. During their tenure, the ships were both cherished by their crews and revered by the public. Among them was the Royal Canadian Navy's HMCS Haida. As the fourth Tribal to grace the Royal Canadian Navy, Haida was commissioned on August 30th, 1943, with the seasoned Harry DeWolf at its helm. With a quarter-century of naval expertise under his belt, DeWolf aimed to elevate Canada's maritime reputation. By the end of 1943, after rigorous sea trials, Haida secured her place within the 3rd Canadian Destroyer Flotilla and part of the British Home Fleet. The ongoing Battle of the Atlantic meant Allied convoys were in need of strong protectors against the persistent threats of German U-boats and surface raiders. In this challenging and ever-changing backdrop, Haida was ready to take on a pivotal role. At first glance, her primary armament comprised 6 dominant 4.7-inch QF Mark 12 guns aligned in 3 twin mounts, which was enough to scare almost any floating enemy away. For the skyward enemies, her defenses included a lone but powerful 4-inch QF Mark 5 gun, augmented by full robust 2-pounder QF Mark 8 guns, always on the lookout for hostile aircraft. Hidden below her decks, a menacing foursome of 21-inch torpedo tubes stood in a unique quad setup, awaiting a chance to challenge larger-sized foes. Deeper still, where only submarines dared to venture, Haida had her depth charges at the ready. In November, she was assigned as an escort for the Russian convoy RA-54B, one of many Arctic convoys that transported essential supplies to the Soviet Union. The cold waters, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of torpedoes made these missions particularly risky. During one journey, the Kriegsmarine battleship Scharnhorst attempted to intercept the convoy. While the escorting cruisers managed to keep the German vessel occupied, Haida and her fellow destroyers guided the convoy away from the threat. On December 23rd, the convoy faced an attack once more, this time from Junkers Ju-88 bombers. Again, Haida's defenses ensured the convoy went undamaged. Besides her convoy escort duties, Haida was involved in offensive operations along the Norwegian coast, engaging German naval vessels when the opportunity arose. By January 10, 1944, Haida had moved to the 10th Destroyer Flotilla in Plymouth. There, she and her crew participated in Operation Tunnel and Operation Hostile, operations in the Bay of Biscay and along the French coast of the English Channel, aimed at confronting and neutralizing the fast German naval vessels that posed a threat to Allied naval movements. Haida was a key player in these operations with her advanced anti-ship and anti-submarine weaponry. By the spring, she had completed almost 20 missions under Operation Tunnel and Operation Hostile. In mid-April 1944, Haida, along with her sister ships HMS Ashanti, HMCS Abadaskan, HMCS Huron, and the Dido-class cruiser HMS Black Prince, embarked on an Operation Hostile mission in the English Channel. Days passed, with the ships weaving through waters, the radar systems alive with signals, all with a direct yet perilous mission: detect the enemy and engage. In the early hours of April 26th, they confronted the German 4th Torpedo Boat Flotilla, which boasted the Evelyn-class torpedo boats T-29, T-24, and T-27. Though named torpedo boats, these German vessels essentially matched mid-sized Allied destroyers in size, albeit with slightly less firepower. T-27 took damage early on and retreated. The unforgiving guns aboard Haida sent T-29 to the ocean floor, while T-24, though wounded, managed to flee. A little more than 48 hours later, while on patrol off St. Brieuc near Brittany, both Abadaskan and Haida received intel of 2 enemy ships nearby. The duo pressed on. However, the crew of Haida soon discerned a concerning sight. Abadaskan had suddenly stopped. It was April 29, 1944, and Abadaskan had just fallen victim to a torpedo launched by T-27, the very boat that had eluded them earlier. Grasping the gravity of the situation, Commander de Wolf of Haida immediately launched a counteroffensive, warding off the German assailant. Yet, despite his best efforts, Abadaskan was overwhelmed by flames. The sister ship was going down. Having pursued T-27 and set her aground, showering her with shells, Haida made her way back. Drawing close to her sister ship, she fired a star shell, illuminating the darkness and signaling the beginning of a rescue mission. Deploying her boats, floats, and scramble nets, Haida's valiant crew pulled aboard scores of oil-slicked men, some dazed, others wounded, all grateful. Every ounce of de Wolf's determination was poured into rescuing as many comrades as possible. Yet as they worked, he knew all too well that peril was on the horizon. The very German boats that had damaged Abadaskan were still in the vicinity. Every second in this vulnerable position heightened the risk of Haida becoming their next target. Amid this backdrop, and with dawn threatening to blow their cover, Captain de Wolf made the heart-wrenching decision to cease the rescue. The toll was heavy. Abadaskan lost 128 brave souls, including her captain, John Stubbs. A further 83 men were captured, becoming prisoners of war. Yet, thanks to Haida, 44 fortunate men found refuge aboard her decks. The Canadian Tribal-class destroyer persistently carried out Operation Hostile sorties alongside her sister ship, Huron, in the suspense-filled weeks leading up to Operation Overlord. As the historic invasion of Normandy began, Haida, steadfastly standing as part of the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, played a pivotal role in providing cover for surface attacks at the far western entrance of the English Channel. Merely days later, in a synchronized maritime ballet, Haida and Huron joined forces to sink the submarine Z-32 in the iconic Battle of Ushant. With the fall of Cherbourg, the formidable Kriegsmarine E-boats that had long shadowed and threatened Haida were subsequently relocated. This strategic shift freed Haida and her flotilla from their persistent menace. In the ensuing period, the flotilla was endowed with dual responsibilities. They protected Allied torpedo boat flotillas and relentlessly embarked on search and sink operations against German vessels along the entirety of the French coast. On June 24th, the inseparable sister ships, Haida and Eskimo, sank one more enemy boat and rescued 6 of her survivors. Throughout July and August, Haida was on a mission to intercept and counter German vessels. In this period, she sank a notable tally of submarine chasers, minesweepers, and patrol boats, always in unison with her convoy. Haida became renowned for her unmatched destructive prowess, impressively sinking 9 enemy ships between April and September of 1944. This remarkable success can be largely credited to one exceptional leader. During Harry DeWolf's distinguished 14-month tenure as Haida's commanding officer, she sank an astounding 14 enemy vessels. DeWolf's brave, courageous, and inspirational leadership rightfully earned him the enduring nickname Hardover Harry. After being promoted to captain in September, DeWolf was slated for a return to Canada, meaning he'd have to leave Haida. Though DeWolf commanded a fleet of ships during his illustrious naval career, his profound connection with Haida became a defining feature of his legacy. Over the ensuing years, this fearless leader climbed to the rank of Vice Admiral, eventually taking the reins of the Royal Canadian Navy. However, the story of Haida in World War II still had chapters left. With the change in leadership, Haida, holding her head high, departed Western Europe on September 22nd for Halifax, Nova Scotia, to receive state-of-the-art radar. For the rest of that year, Haida predominantly sailed on escort missions. Towards the end of the war, Haida played a role in one of the last Canadian naval engagements when she valiantly escorted convoy RA-66 from Venga from late April to early May 1945. During this intense mission, both Haida and her sister ship, Huron, miraculously dodged torpedoes from lurking U-boats. This naval skirmish witnessed the sinking of 2 U-boats and a Royal Navy vessel in the icy waters. After her extensive service, Haida returned to Canada in June 1945. She was earmarked for a refit, but fate had other plans. The refit was abruptly suspended when Japan, marking the end of a global conflict, announced its surrender later that summer. After World War II, HMCS Haida took a brief respite, only to be reactivated in 1947, refitted with contemporary armament, and rebranded as a destroyer escort. Subsequently, Haida and her sister ship, HMCS Nootka, participated in exercises with the Canadian Navy's Atlantic Fleet, the U.S. Navy, and the Royal Navy. By November 1949, she was back in Halifax, Canada. She was swiftly enlisted to rescue 18 crew members from a U.S. Air Force bomber that had crashed in the Atlantic. Yet, only a month later, being one of the older vessels in the Navy's lineup, she was downgraded to serve as a depot and accommodation ship in Halifax. The onset of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, saw Haida reactivated for combat once again. Refitted the subsequent month with fresh armaments and cutting-edge sensors, she spent 2 patrols off the Korean coast, escorting aircraft carriers and executing coastal bombardments. After striking a train north of Rewan and neutralizing a rogue anti-ship mine in January 1953, Haida was inducted into the esteemed Train Busters Club, performing essential train-busting operations. By December, despite the ceasefire, she remained in the area to be a strong Allied naval presence. Post-Korea, Haida undertook anti-submarine warfare tasks alongside other North Atlantic and West Indies NATO vessels. However, by 1958, the wear and tear became more evident than ever. Her hull cracked, equipment malfunctioned, and steering faltered. A 1958 refit for repairs only briefly postponed the inevitable. After a 1960 voyage to the West Indies was cut short due to equipment failures, more structural concerns surfaced. This war hero's finale was imminent. In 1963, after one final and sentimental tour of the Great Lakes, she was set for scrapping. Remarkably, she was the last survivor of the 27 tribal-class ships. All her counterparts had either been lost in combat accidents or had been decommissioned. Not willing to let their beloved and iconic ship go, a group of ex-crew members, wishing to safeguard her legacy, acquired the ship. Their dedication ensured Haida's restoration, and by 1984, she was recognized as a National Historic Site. Her unparalleled adaptability to evolving battle scenarios, reinforced by superior design, a hint of luck, and most importantly, the indomitable spirit of her crew, ensured her prolonged survival. Today, HMCS Haida stands tall, celebrated as the fightingest ship in the Royal Canadian Navy. This moniker is not just a testament to her combat prowess, but a tribute to the undying spirit and determination of her crew throughout the decades. In early 1940, the German oil tanker Altmark was traveling through neutral Norwegian waters, hoping to avoid being spotted by the fearsome Royal Navy. The ship was carrying almost 300 Allied prisoners of war, rescued from vessels sunk by the Admiral Graf Spee pocket battleship in the southern Atlantic Ocean during the first months of World War II. When Altmark was spotted by a British aircraft, she found refuge in a fjord, accompanied by a Norwegian escort. But the British were determined to rescue the prisoners, and the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, led by HMS Cossack and her captain Philip Blann, was tasked with following the formation. The British then made several attempts to board Altmark, but the Norwegians suddenly aimed their torpedo tubes at Cossack. Soon, all three sides settled for a standoff. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, ordered Blann to take back the prisoners and only use force if necessary. However, the Germans would not give up so easily, and fierce hand-to-hand combat ensued. It was the Germans and the British who were fighting each other, but the encounter would mostly have disastrous consequences for Norway. In late August of 1939, Altmark, a German oil tanker, stopped at Port Arthur, Texas, to take on a load of fuel. However, while sailing across the Atlantic on the way home, her crew received the news that war was imminent. As such, the ship was ordered to travel to the South Atlantic in support of Admiral Graf Spee, a Deutschland-class Panzerschiff that served with the Kriegsmarine, performing commerce raid operations against Allied merchant traffic. Altmark would work side by side with her as her replenishment ship. After rendezvousing on September 1st, the converted oil tanker was equipped with a pair of 20mm anti-aircraft guns, complete with a naval detachment to handle the weapons and radio equipment. While the official rules dictated that Graf Spee had to rescue the crews of every ship she sank, the most common seamen were usually transferred to Altmark when the two ships met up to replenish, and the officers would be retained aboard the cruiser. Still, the conditions aboard the converted ship were austere. After sinking many enemy boats throughout the fall, Admiral Graf Spee's patrols came to a sudden end before the year was over. In the middle of December, 3 Royal Navy cruisers intercepted the infamous pocket-sized battleship and damaged her so much that her crew opted to scuttle her. With Graf Spee resting at the bottom of the ocean, Altmark's captain, Heinrich Dow, decided to head back to Germany with all prisoners aboard. However, this would not be an easy task. At the outbreak of World War II, the United Kingdom's Royal Navy dominated most of the seas, and many of its naval ships were either in home waters or near other nations trying to blockade Germany. In addition, a number of released officers revealed the existence of Altmark and her secret prisoners. Meanwhile, supplies began to run low, as Altmark remained in the South Atlantic for another few weeks. Believing that the best way to get home was to go around Great Britain through the north, Dow gave orders to pass through the Norwegian littoral. First disguised as a Norwegian tanker, and then as an American one, Altmark somehow managed to elude the British and pass through the south of Iceland before entering the coastal waters of neutral Norway on February 14, 1940. Captain Dow's plan was to take advantage of the nation's political position, stay in Norwegian waters for a few days, and then dash across the Skagerrak Strait to reach Danish waters back to safety. Believing Altmark was carrying British prisoners, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill demanded that the Norwegians search the vessel at once. Cautious not to risk their neutral status, the Norwegians reluctantly agreed and sent a torpedo boat to inspect the ship. During the check-in with authorities, Captain Dow did not try to hide the ship's identity, stating that Altmark was merely a state-owned tanker on her way from Texas to Germany. Wary of a belligerent Germany and an insistent Royal Navy, the Norwegian boarding parties did not really do a thorough job, as the nation mostly wanted the incident to be over as quickly as possible and get the potentially dangerous ship out of their waters. Hence, the officials accepted Dou's word and agreed to let Altmark proceed. Nevertheless, several sources claim that many top officials within the Royal Norwegian Navy were utterly aware of Altmark's current role and ordered that she be escorted at all times while sailing in their protected waters. To Captain Dou's frustration, and at the insistence of the British forces, the ship was inspected 2 more times on the 15th, accompanied by lots of questions about armament and the possibility of having non-German citizens on board. Dou denied everything. During the 3rd inspection, however, the hidden prisoners shouted, stomped, and banged the walls. Still, it is unknown whether the Norwegians didn't hear the trapped soldiers or chose not to. While transporting prisoners through neutral waters was not illegal per se, the Norwegian authorities declined to take action without direct orders from their government. Still, Altmark was ordered to avoid the exclusion zone around the Bergen port, thus forcing her to pass through international waters, where the Royal Navy would potentially attack her. Dou vehemently protested the decision, even reaching the German embassy in Oslo, and Altmark was eventually allowed to pass through the exclusion zone. The same day Altmark was allowed to pass through the exclusion zone, a British aircraft flying over Norway spotted the German tanker. A detachment of ships from the Royal Navy, led by the destroyer HMS Cossack under Captain Philip Vlan, was immediately sent to pursue Altmark and find out as much as possible. But after being intercepted by Cossack, Altmark sought refuge in the 3-kilometer-long Ysingfjord in southwestern Norway. Still, Cossack went after her the following day. As the Allies tried to approach Altmark, her Norwegian escort ships blocked Vlan's men from boarding her, and the local officers warned Cossack that they would open fire if they made more attempts. Unsure of how to proceed, Captain Vlan asked the British Admiralty for instructions. In response, Churchill issued a message that read, quote, "Unless Norwegian torpedo boat undertakes to convey Altmark to Bergen with a joint Anglo-Norwegian guard on board and a joint escort, you should board Altmark, liberate the prisoners, and take possession of the ship, pending further instructions." As guided by Churchill, if the Norwegians interfered by opening fire, then the captain would have to respond using no more force than necessary. Vlan then asked permission to board the German ship alongside a team of Norwegians, but he was denied once again. The following evening, in an attempt to ram Cossack, Altmark ran aground in the shallow waters of the Norwegian fjord. Seizing their one chance, Cossack was steered closer to Altmark, and over 30 British men boarded her at 10:22 p.m. While historians disagree on who started the fight, the British quickly gained the upper hand. At such close quarters and without guns, the Royal Navy crew members engaged the Germans in hand-to-hand combat using cutlasses. It was the last recorded incident of the Royal Navy ever doing so. The event became known as the Altmark Incident. Ultimately, 8 Germans lost their lives, and about a dozen more were seriously injured, including an unlucky Norwegian in one of the torpedo boats. The Altmark's crew was overwhelmed during the brisk fight, and the Germans eventually surrendered. After thoroughly searching the ship, the boarding party found 299 prisoners of war. The men went wild when they heard someone yelling, "The Navy's here," a phrase that became a popular rallying cry through the remainder of the war. HMS Cossack and the prisoners reached port on the afternoon of February 17, 1940, to much jubilation from the British public. Afterward, Churchill publicized the victory all he could to boost the people's morale, and the prisoners' conditions were greatly exaggerated to add fire to the rumors of Nazi atrocities in Poland. While the Altmark incident was a propaganda coup for the British, it had severe implications for Norway. The Norwegian officials were highly disgruntled with the British for boarding the German ship and violating their neutral status. Still, their overall sympathy towards the Allies prevailed, and no action was taken beyond strong diplomatic messaging. Moreover, upon hearing the news that 299 British prisoners were lost, at the cost of 4 German lives, Adolf Hitler was enraged. According to the Führer, Altmark and her crew did not fight hard enough against the British boarding detachment. Until this point, Hitler wanted to keep Norway a neutral nation, so that Germany's need for iron ore grown in Sweden and transported through Norway could remain uninterrupted. However, Hitler was now convinced that he could no longer trust Norway, and decided to intensify his planning for an invasion of the country, in order to safeguard the more than 11 million tons of iron ore that Germany got from Sweden every year. Operation Weserübung was then launched on April 9th with the objective of taking Denmark and Norway. The countries were occupied by Nazi Germany in less than 2 months, and the Western theater operations were now in full swing. Captain Hans Langsdorff knew there was no way out. For the last 3 months, the Kriegsmarine's most successful commerce raider to date, Graf Spee, had been devastating the Atlantic with gallantry, but those days were almost over. Langsdorff was contemplating his valuable ship from the harbor of Montevideo as he thought of the immediate future. Following prize rules and saving merchant crews before sinking their ships had resulted in his downfall. The British and French had tracked Graf Spee and were out there on the horizon, waiting to finish her off. There were only 2 options going forward. Langsdorff could muster the tired crew for one last ride, or scuttle the ship to prevent her from falling into the hands of the British. Following the ceasefire of World War I, Prussian Empire was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This document forced Germany to declare itself the sole provocateur of the gruesome conflict that drained Europe. And to further humiliate the Germans, their territorial possessions were to be dismembered and shared between the victors. The treaty also limited the size of Germany's army, and the country could no longer develop new technology for aircraft or surface ships. They would have to manage with a few pre-dreadnought ships and outdated aircraft. Moreover, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 imposed limits on the tonnage, size, and construction of surface vessels, and only allowed the Germans to build ships that displaced a maximum of 10,000 tons. Meanwhile, the victors of World War I could build warships of up to 35,000 tons. The Reichsmarine had a disproportionate disadvantage against most European navies, but German naval officers would not give up easily. As such, they began working on an ambitious warship design that would allow the German Navy to develop powerful vessels without breaking the ignominious naval treaty. The German naval officers' preliminary studies had one objective: to come up with a new type of surface vessel that could be light enough to not exceed the tonnage limit of the 1922 naval treaty, but also armed to the teeth to be capable of destroying enemy warships that were heavier and larger. It took the Germans years to envision the ideal vessel, and numerous designs were ditched and modified. It wasn't until 1928 that they came up with their Deutschland-class warship. The German delegation had arduous negotiations with Britain, France, and the United States to get clearance for their new design. They ultimately prevailed and got to work right away. 3 Deutschland-class warships were built, and they were classified as Panzerschiffe, or armored cruisers. The weight and dimensions of each vessel would vary according to unique improvements. Still, they all had the same purposes. They were designed to outgun any hostile cruiser fast enough to approach them, or else outspeed the rest. Due to their heavy weaponry, the United Kingdom and the US would later classify them as pocket battleships, as they were to be armed with 6 powerful 28-centimeter guns. When designing pocket battleships, the Germans conducted meticulous testing on the average speed of French and British warships. Based on the definitive Panzerschiffe's design, the Germans concluded that the enemy ships that were able to match the speed of their pocket battleships lacked enough armament to damage them, and they planned to exploit this advantage to its fullest in the case of conflict. Following the passing of President Paul von Hindenburg in 1934, the Nationalist Socialist Party rose to power with Chancellor Adolf Hitler as its head. The future Führer was quick to give his full support to the military leaders who followed and supported Germany's rearmament. The Reichsmarine was renamed the Kriegsmarine, and naval development rapidly increased. Panzerschiff Graf Spee had been ordered just a year before, on October 1, 1942, from the Reichsmarine Werft shipyard in Wilhelmshaven. The ship was named after Prussian Admiral Maximilian von Spee, who lost his life during the Battle of the Falkland Islands in World War I. Graf Spee would replace the old pre-dreadnought battleship Braunschweig. She was launched on June 30, 1934, and christened by the daughter of the deceased admiral of the Prussian Imperial Navy. The pocket battleship was then finished on January 6th. The Deutschland-class cruiser was 186 meters long, had a beam of 21.65 meters, and a draft of 7.34 meters. Although Graf Spee was officially designed within the tonnage limit of the treaties, she exceeded them by adding more armament. Graf Spee displaced over 16,000 tons when fully loaded, and was powered by 8 MAN-9 diesel engines that produced 56,000 horsepower to 2 propeller shafts. These propellers saved valuable weight that was used to provide Graf Spee with better armor. Meanwhile, the ship's armored belt was 100 millimeters thick, the main armored deck was between 40 and 70 millimeters thick, and the upper deck only had 17 millimeters of armor. As for the armor in the main guns, it was 140 millimeters thick in the front and 70 millimeters on the sides. Graf Spee's maximum speed was 52.8 kilometers per hour, with an estimated range of about 30,000 kilometers if traveling at a speed of 34 kilometers per hour. Her main armament comprised 6 28-centimeter SKC-28 guns mounted in 2 triple-gun turrets. One was mounted forward and the other aft. The second battery consisted of 8 15-centimeter SKC-28 guns mounted in single turrets amidships. The ship was later upgraded with 6 105mm, 8 37mm, and over 10 20mm cannons that could be used against surface and land-based targets. Additionally, the pocket battleship also carried a pair of deck-mounted torpedo tubes located at the stern and had space for a catapult from which 2 Arado AR-196C aircraft could be launched for air reconnaissance. Graf Spee was manned by a crew of 30 officers and over 1,040 sailors. She soon completed successful sea trials and was promptly sent to the Atlantic for non-intervention patrols during the summer of 1936. As the Spanish Civil War broke out, the Kriegsmarine was ready to take its ships for testing. While the Republican Party was aided by the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the United States, and several other countries, the Nationalist Party, led by Army General Francisco Franco, was supported by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Graf Spee helped expose the war assets the Soviet Union and other countries lent to the Republicans, which also prompted the Germans and Italians to support Franco with equipment and men from the Condor Legion. Following her first tour in Spain, Graf Spee assisted in the coronation review at Spithead for King George VI. She was then returned to Spain to continue patrolling the Atlantic. During her 5th patrol in 1938, Captain Hans Wilhelm Longsdorff assumed command of the ship and made numerous visits to foreign ports before being called to Germany as tensions rose in Europe. Following the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, France and Britain issued an ultimatum that then turned into a declaration of war when the Reich invaded Poland with the support of the Soviet Union. In September of 1939, Graf Spee was sailing in the Atlantic when Hitler ordered the Kriegsmarine to launch commerce raids against Allied merchant vessels. Graf Spee then began stopping and searching ships for contraband. If war supplies were found, the ship's crew would be evacuated before sending the merchant vessels to the ocean's depths. After that, Captain Longsdorff always sent a distress signal so that the crews could be picked up. But as Graf Spee continued sinking more ships, the distress signals became a trend that was ultimately used by the British Admiralty to prepare a task force to hunt her down. In early October, the French and British assembled 8 groups to hunt down Graf Spee in the South Atlantic. More than 12 vessels left Europe to go after Captain Longsdorff and his crew. Meanwhile, Graf Spee kept her successful streak, sinking the steamer Newton Beach, the merchant Ashleia, and the steamer Huntsman. These ships' crews were kept safe and transported to the vessel Altmark, which had been refueling Graf Spee for the past months. By mid-October, Admiral Graf Spee left the waters of South America after sinking the steamer Trevanian and made way for the Indian Ocean to confuse the Allied hunting parties going after her. Still, the French and British warships were not going to give up so easily. In mid-November, Graf Spee intercepted the tanker MV Africa Shell. Days later, she went after the British merchant ship Doric Star, which refused to stop for the German inspection. Captain Longsdorff then gave the order to fire and sank the ship. However, Doric Star was able to send a distress signal before going down, alerting the Anglo-French task force. After sinking the vessels SS Tyroa and Strenshall, Graf Spee stopped to refuel with Altmark and transferred more prisoners. Captain Longsdorff then ordered the pocket battleship to head for Montevideo after the crew recovered the shipping routes of more Allied merchants. During the early hours of December 13, 1939, lookouts from Graf Spee spotted HMS Exeter and other British warships. This encounter would lead to the Battle of River Plate. Admiral Graf Spee and her crew fought bravely against overwhelming odds before realizing that the pocket battleship would likely fall into the hands of the enemy. After being hit more than 70 times by a force that significantly outnumbered them, Captain Longsdorff headed to Montevideo for repairs. Still, he knew the Allied fleet would converge there to finish them off. To avoid this, Longsdorff decided to scuttle the ship, which took place on December 18th. 2 days later, he shot himself in his Buenos Aires hotel room. After 1 hour of dashing madly across the Surigao Strait under ceaseless Japanese warplane fire, the 3 brand-new American Sumner-class destroyers finally made it to their target, Ormoc Bay. The damaged destroyers had burst into one of the most heavily defended ports in the Pacific Theater to destroy as many ships, military assets, supply depots, and military men as they could. It was practically a suicide mission. Once there, the state-of-the-art vessels were met by a blistering barrage of enemy fire, unlike most sailors had witnessed in their lives, and were completely engulfed in a haze of shore, sea-based, air, and undersea weapons. Soon, a lucky torpedo found its target on USS Cooper, which plummeted into the seabed in less than a minute. But her brave sailors continued fighting, firing at the enemy ships as much as they could before being swallowed by the sea. The chaos was terrifying and all-encompassing, but the forgotten Battle of Ormoc Bay, one of the Pacific's fiercest and most crucial engagements, was just beginning. It had been nearly a month after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, and the situation in the contested Philippine Islands remained critical. The U.S. had managed to gain a toehold on the eastern half of Leyte, but the Japanese were throwing as many reinforcements and supplies as possible in a defiant bid to keep control of the island. The struggle devolved into a clash between 2 ambitious generals, fueled by their stalwart resolve and sizable egos. On the one hand, the Japanese High Command was pressuring General Tomoyuki Yamashita to defend Leyte as if it were his own homeland. If it fell, the Japanese hold over the Philippines would follow. On the other hand, General Douglas MacArthur was eager to keep his lofty vow to the Filipinos, and he was prepared to unleash the entire might of the U.S. military to liberate the archipelago and send the Japanese reeling back into the Northwest Pacific. At first, the Americans were led to believe the Japanese forces were about to withdraw from the island, as the recently broken Purple Code allowed them to intercept messages depicting a massive movement of Japanese convoys. Soon, however, the Americans realized the Japanese were not retreating. In fact, they were increasing their resupply efforts in a massive operation, with Ormoc Bay in its center. After months of scrambling to halt the seemingly endless supply of fresh troops and resources, the U.S. finally had something that could severely cripple the Japanese. General Tomoyuki Yamashita thought the United States Navy had undergone severe casualties and was susceptible to a counterattack, so he continued to amass his troops. Meanwhile, MacArthur strengthened his forces in the area, convinced that the enemy supply lines could be severed, leading to the fall of Leyte. Ormoc Bay was covered by a wide set of military defenses, ranging from constant air patrols, massive coastal batteries, shore troop presence, and a considerable amount of Japanese destroyers and submarines ready to retaliate. Moreover, the port had restricted access through 2 narrow channels, one in the northwest under enemy control and another in the south, which was heavily mined. Both were too shallow to allow any vessel larger than a destroyer to pass through, and MacArthur would not be able to rely on the support of his capital ships. Vice Admiral James L. Kaufman, who had just taken over as commander of the Philippine Sea Frontier, was facing intense pressure from General MacArthur to take action and stop Japanese reinforcements from reaching the area. In response, on November 27, 1944, he issued an order to have the Kanagawa Channel cleared of mines by the minesweepers USS Pursuit and USS Revenge. It was believed to be the obvious solution. Once the mines were cleared in the following days, the U.S. executed 2 incursions into the bay, but the destroyers found no Japanese ships or military activity in the vicinity. In one of the missions, the destroyer USS Waller, aided by a spotting PBY Catalina, dashed into the port unopposed and began pummeling the facilities with their main battery. Incredibly, there was little response. Soon, however, the Catalina spotted a Japanese submarine surfacing nearby, and USS Waller lost no time engaging. A fierce battle ensued, but the submarine was no match for the destroyer and was soon blasted into the bottom of the sea. During 2 other raids, American PT boats and destroyers managed to pierce the bay and deal some damage, even sinking a Japanese transport ship approaching the port. However, they did not find any significant naval movement either. Everything would change the following day, and Kaufman received an urgent message alerting him of a massive gathering of enemy ships in the port. The opportunity Kaufman and MacArthur had been waiting for had just presented itself. Just in the nick of time, Destroyer Squadron 60 arrived at the anchorage in Uliti Atoll and joined the 7th Fleet. The squadron was unique in that it included 7 of the newly designed Sumner-class destroyers. Unlike other modern U.S. destroyers with only 2 5-inch mounts forward, the Sumners had 4. Additionally, they were the first destroyers to have twin rudders, making them capable of faster turns, a crucial feature in close quarters such as Ormoc Bay. On December 2nd, Commander John C. Zahm was summoned aboard the flagship USS Portland, anchored at San Pedro Bay. Vice Admiral Kaufman handed him a copy of CTG Dispatch 02356, marked Secret. The document ordered him to take his 3 ships, USS Allen M. Sumner, USS Cooper, and USS Mole, into Ormoc Bay at midnight. He was instructed to destroy any enemy ships on his path and inflict maximum damage to the dock and warehouses. The ships were so new, the paint on their hull was still drying. Moreover, merely 15% of the sailors and officers assigned to the mission had previous combat experience. Just 15 minutes after setting off, a swarm of Japanese fighters descended from the clouds and began raining fire upon the American destroyers. One of the warplanes was shot down, but the rest continued to harass Zahm's forces as they made their way to their target. At 11 p.m., the ship sounded the alarm when they detected another wave of enemy aircraft. A bomber made a close pass on Sumner, puncturing her entire starboard side with 90 holes and starting a fire that made her a much more vulnerable target. The aircraft continued to attack the 3 ships. Damaged but undeterred, they pushed on until they finally reached the port, where the real battle would take place. When the destroyers pierced the bay at 12 a.m. on December 6th, they were welcomed by an unprecedented outpouring of enemy fire from every direction. Packs of Japanese fast PT boats descended on the Americans. Shore batteries began to target them from the coastline, and the unrelenting aircraft continued to engage the destroyers continuously. Upon encountering the Japanese forces, the American destroyers immediately began to fire back with lethal efficiency. Then, like a well-oiled machine, the 3 destroyers fired synchronized, targeting a transport ship caught in the middle of disembarking enemy troops. The overwhelming fire proved too much for the enemy transport ship, which burst into flames and began sinking. Most Japanese servicemen never made it to the shore, with some desperately jumping into the sea to avoid the growing flames. After sinking the transport, the 3 ships concentrated their fire on several depots and cranes across the docks. But soon, they detected the Japanese destroyer Kua trying to make a surprise attack on them. Again, the American destroyers channeled their combined firepower and sank Kua before she was able to escape. The Sumner-class destroyers were performing brilliantly, and it all pointed to a decisive victory. However, the Japanese still had some aces up their sleeves. Many submarines and destroyers that remained close to shore to avoid radar detection suddenly began unleashing their guns and torpedoes on the attackers. A submarine torpedo then slammed into the hull of USS Cooper, carving a massive hole in one of her sides. Torpedo Officer Douglas Campbell would later describe the experience, quote, "When the Cooper was hit with that shuddering thud, I was on the bridge. I was immediately propelled into the water and felt myself being dragged down. I then realized that I was tied to the ship by my sound-powered phone line. Fortunately, I had a sharp knife strapped to my belt, and it came in handy freeing me. I shot toward the surface and came up amid burning debris and oil." Cooper sank in less than a minute, dragging dozens of American sailors to the bottom of the sea, while the rest struggled to swim amid the oil, fire, and debris. The other American ships were too heavily engaged to mount a rescue operation, but continued to suppress the numerous Japanese coastal guns and warships trying to sink them. At 12:33 a.m., the 2 surviving destroyers were ordered to retreat from the bay. The Japanese claimed the battle as a victory, but the American ships had managed to sink several enemy ships, destroy countless military assets, and disrupt a significant supply operation that would weaken the Japanese presence in the region. Meanwhile, the survivors of USS Cooper desperately attempted to swim to a nearby shore, and in an incredibly fortunate turn of events, were spotted by 2 consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats. The pilots were deeply moved by the sailors' ordeal and refused to leave a single man behind. Instead, the U.S. airmen threw out everything that was not vital and instructed the survivors to do the same with their gear, including their shoes. Significantly surpassing their flight capacity, the Catalinas carried up to 59 sailors each. Incredibly, they were able to take off and save the stranded sailors. The fearless pilots were eventually rewarded with a medal for their bravery and determination. The engagement would become the only battle at sea during the war that saw the deployment of every type of weapon in the enemy's arsenal, including naval artillery, torpedoes, airstrikes, submarine assaults, coastal artillery, and mines. Zom's suicide mission had been a bittersweet affair. They had lost hundreds of sailors and a destroyer, but caused unmeasurable damage to the enemy and their capability to reinforce Leyte. Now it was time for MacArthur to make his next move. The U.S. deployed a massive amphibious and air operation to kick the Japanese while they were down, and on the evening of December 6th, approximately 8,000 soldiers from the 77th Division boarded several types of small landing vessels. Under cover of darkness, they navigated around the southern edge of Leyte and reached Ormoc Bay by dawn. They then landed in Deposito, a small village 5 miles south of Ormoc City, which placed them behind enemy lines. Meanwhile, the 7th Infantry Division advanced from the south along the coast, while the 11th Airborne Division moved down from the north towards Ormoc City. By then, General Yamashita had hastily reinforced the bay, and close to 40,000 Japanese soldiers were in the area. Thankfully for the Americans, they were disorganized, depleted, and with a great deal of demolished infrastructure. As such, they were unable to mount a defensive operation. The Japanese made several efforts to resupply their positions, but they were defeated every time, and soon the American forces were able to secure Ormoc Bay and the city. From there, the fall of Leyte was just a matter of time. The lookouts saw nothing. The radar spotted nothing, and the skipper aboard the USS Parche submarine was desperate and restless to find the elusive Japanese convoy in the South China Sea. The commanding officer hopped back and forth between the radar screen in the conning tower and plot tables in the control room until they finally found it. Commander Lawson Red Ramage then cleared the bridge and steamed directly into the enemy formation up on the surface while maneuvering between the ships. In the words of author Clay Drury Blair Jr., quote, "With consummate seamanship and coolness under fire, Ramage dodged and twisted." The commander then opened fire, and the enemy answered with deck guns and even tried to ram the sneaky submarine. But Ramage was determined to cause as much damage as possible, and the torpedo shooting that night was unlike anything the Japanese had experienced before. The submarine's wolf pack, known as Park's Pirates, departed the island of Midway in mid-June of 1944. Led by Commander Louis Parks, the pack was tasked with patrolling the area between Formosa and Luzon in a chase for Japanese merchant ships. The group was composed of USS Steelhead, USS Hammerhead, and USS Parche, and Parche's commander suggested that they should be called the Headhunters, given that they had Steelhead, Hammerhead, and himself, Lawson Ramage, a redhead. The veteran of the group was Steelhead, sailing on her 6th patrol. For Parche, it was her 2nd mission, while Hammerhead was on her very 1st patrol. They were to conduct offensive missions in the South China Sea and destroy any enemy forces they encountered. For centuries, the Luzon Strait, a 230-mile stretch bridging Taiwan and the Philippines, had been a strategic gateway in the region. In the last stages of the Pacific War in mid-1944, Japanese mariners even dubbed the strait the Devil's Sea, as the area was full of lurking American submarines determined to sink their Marus, or merchant ships. The 3 vessels arrived on July 1st and devoted their time to roaming the area, submerged by day and surfaced by night. But for the best part of a month, the headhunters saw little action. Still, according to Red Ramage, the stretch was the most lucrative patrol area in the entire Pacific, or at least it was supposed to be. On July 4th, Parche spotted 3 warships heading southwest. But as the submarine prepared to attack, the Japanese struck first. Ramage was then forced to flee because of the enemy's surprisingly accurate salvos. 2 weeks later, Parche's lookouts found a lone aircraft carrier. Ramage thought it was a, quote, perfect dream come true, but when the carrier launched patrol aircraft, the commander's dream was again frustrated. The following week, there was a report that the Japanese submarine I-29 would sail through the area. Moreover, it was believed that she was carrying strategic materials and blueprints from Germany, thus becoming the Wolfpack's top priority. The American ships formed a picket line to intercept the precious vessel, but it wasn't Parche nor Ramage who claimed the victory. Then, on July 30th, while Ramage and his crew wondered if their disappointment would ever end, promising news finally came through. At 4:20 a.m., Hammerhead reported sighting a convoy only 20 miles south of Parche's position. 18 minutes later, Hammerhead reconfirmed the position and added that she was now engaging the enemy on the port flank. However, as the hours passed, Ramage and even Parkes began to suspect that Hammerhead's information was wrong. They should have encountered the convoy 3 hours ago. Then Parkes asked the skipper, Lieutenant Commander John Martin, to verify the location. The enemy was now 30 miles north of Parche. Mildly irritated, Ramage turned around and headed there. Before long, the commanders realized that they were moving fast, but going nowhere. Yet again, Parkes asked for verification, and Martin reported a revised position at 30 miles to the northwest. By now, Ramage was extremely exasperated, and even wondered if there was an enemy convoy at all. After finishing her unsuccessful attack, Hammerhead departed for Fremantle, Australia. It was later determined that she had miscoded the convoy's positions. In reality, there was indeed a sizable Japanese convoy composed of 18 ships carrying 10,000 troops and thousands of tons of supplies, with 7 warships escorting it. Still, Parche was unaware. Discouraged, Ramage took the boat deep below the water at 6:21 a.m. to avoid enemy anti-submarine patrols. After her futile chase, Parche remained submerged for the entire day, although the crew kept on the lookout through the periscope. At 10:30 in the morning, Steelhead sighted convoy Mi-11 and quickly went after it. However, Ramage would not learn the news until several hours later because of being under radio silence. It was only when Parche resurfaced towards the end of the day that her crew picked up a position report from her teammate. The convoy was now crossing the strait 35 miles southwest of Parche, which set off at full speed. It took the crew a few hours to find the enemy, for they had made a radical course change. But the convoy finally popped on the radar, and Ramage called for battle stations. Parche crept in from behind the enemy, but the skipper reckoned it would be best to get ahead of the group. Under cover of darkness, the submarine steamed along the convoy on the surface and towards the 3 lead escorts, when suddenly one of them turned in their direction. Ramage had to pull a reverse spinner to turn the ship's nose around. In an unexpected move, the entire 25-ship convoy also turned 90 degrees, and the Americans came into a direct collision course. The crew had to pull off another sharp turn to get out of their way, before repositioning for a proper attack. Then, at 3:56 a.m., Parche fired 2 bow torpedoes, officially kicking off the battle. Within 10 minutes, Ramage detected what he thought was a pair of aircraft carriers, but in reality were large tankers. Resolved, he launched 4 torpedoes toward one of the tankers. The first ripped off the bow, while the other 3 pierced through the middle, and the Koei Maru did not take long to sink. Then Parche pointed her stern at the other ship, Ogura Maru, and fired 3 more charges. An officer later recalled that the skipper, quote, was in his element, just calmly picking targets. Meanwhile, the Japanese were confused, firing flares and shooting indiscriminately. On the other side of the convoy, Steelhead had launched 2 attacks, with at least 1 hit. But while she had to submerge to reload, Ramage had no desire to lose his advantage on the already alerted enemy. Thus, he decided to reload his empty tubes while maneuvering on the surface. It was unprecedented and risky, as the rocking waves could cause a terrible accident while handling the mines. But Ramage had drilled the crew in the technique. Within minutes, Parche had 2 tubes ready, and at 4:16 a.m., she fired at Dakar Maru, and the 7,000-ton transport slowed to a crawl. Parche then re-engaged the damaged Ogura Maru. With shells whistling overhead, Ramage sent all spare hands below, while his torpedo men prepared 3 more charges. Already down by the bow, the tanker could not defend herself from the relentless Americans, and by 4:21 a.m., 3 more torpedoes finished her and dragged her down. As Ramage looked for another target, the gunboat Kazan Maru appeared out of nowhere, racing straight towards his submarine, with clear intentions to ram. Inexplicably, Parche was at a standstill in the middle of the battle when her commander ordered, quote, all ahead flank. If it hadn't been for helmsman Chet Stanton, who gave the order to turn full right at the last moment, Parche would have been cut in half. Ramage gave the instruction a fraction of a second too late. Now clear of danger, Parche spotted her next victim, a 9,000-ton transport. The only problem was that the vessel was straight ahead, leaving a slim chance to shoot it directly at the bow. 2 of 3 torpedoes hit Yoshino Maru, and then Parche launched another from her stern. Then, as the skipper recalled, the transport, quote, suddenly disappeared from sight in one big blurb. At 4:47 a.m., the gyro aiming mechanism in the forward torpedo room jammed, forcing Parche to withdraw. Plus, dawn was about to break. The remarkable battle lasted just 34 minutes, during which the submarine fired 19 torpedoes, 9 of which had been impressively reloaded while on the surface and during relentless action. Parche was credited with 4 ships sunk, while Steelhead sank 2. The episode was eventually dubbed Ramage's Rampage, as it involved more shooting in less time than any other American submarine attack in the entire war. When Park's pirates returned to Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Submarine Force U.S. Pacific Fleet, nominated Ramage for the Medal of Honor. Only 2 submariners had been awarded the United States' highest military honor, both posthumously, making Ramage the first living recipient. Still, Ramage felt the medal was owed to every sailor in his crew, and after the ceremony, he created a certificate for every man under his command, arguing that, quote, every officer and man whose loyal cooperation and able assistance contributed to the success of the USS Parche has an equal share in this award. In only 4 sweltering minutes, the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet had crushed the Italian Regia Marina in the Battle of Cape Matapan, despite the Italians having more significant numbers and faster ships. With 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers swallowed by the sea, 1 capital ship severely damaged, and over 3,000 casualties at the cost of only 3 British sailors and 1 warplane, the Italian Navy's spirits were demolished. The humiliating defeat had Benito Mussolini seething, and he would have his revenge one way or another. A covert scheme was then hatched to deliver a blow to the Mediterranean fleet in its home in the port of Alexandria. In December of 1941, months after Matapan, 6 Italian frogmen commandos boarded 3 small manned torpedoes and dashed under the dimmed Egyptian waters toward the British ships moored at the pier of Alexandria. Between them and their objective, a vast range of mines and submarine nets stood in their way, but the dangerous operatives had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. They would avenge their fallen comrades, no matter the consequences. Once a highly feared force, the Royal Navy was meeting the limit of its reach by the end of 1941. This was especially true of the Mediterranean fleet. Despite crippling the Italian Regia Marina in the Battle of Cape Matapan, considered the largest naval battle in the European theater, a series of recent disasters had left the naval force weaker than ever. The unfortunate streak began less than a month after Matapan with the sinking of HMS York by Italian explosive motorboats, operated by Italian frogmen from the flotilla Decima Flottiglia MAS. November 25th then marked a tragic turn as the battleship HMS Barham met her untimely demise, struck by a torpedo from the U-331 submarine. The toll was immense, with over 800 sailors lost in a devastating explosion. The cruiser Galatea met a similar end weeks later, under the sights of U-557, followed by a British squadron running into a minefield that claimed 4 more invaluable ships. The stakes increased exponentially at the start of December. With Japan joining the Axis powers, the Royal Navy had to spread far further than ever before, as the languid Mediterranean fleet had no hope of receiving reinforcements. Admiral Andrew Cunningham understood the gravity of the situation and knew the fleet could not suffer another sizable strike by the Axis forces, as it could risk the entire Allied war effort. Consequently, the British Navy became more cautious regarding open sea battles in the Mediterranean. However, nobody expected the deceptive subversion that was afoot. Activated in March of 1941, the Decima Flottiglia MAS started its combat service with the bang, destroying HMAS York and conducting several amphibious raids against Allied ships using rigged motorboats and manned torpedoes. For Mussolini, the frogmen, as the men of the Decima Flottiglia were also known, were a precious asset, especially after his fleet had been so blatantly humiliated. Now he would use them to deliver a knockout blow to the Mediterranean fleet. A highly specialized naval unit was assembled that same year to face the Mediterranean fleet, but as the months passed, the Italian High Command wanted to take their success to a whole new level and use it to do what the Regia Marina had failed to do during the Battle of Cape Matapan: destroy the British battleships. The plan was dangerous and ambitious. 6 men would depart from Greece in a lone Italian submarine and would travel 1,700 miles to the waters of Alexandria, where the commandos would slip into the water, board specially designed manned torpedoes, and guide them towards the hulls of 3 of the largest British capital ships in the port. The docks were highly secured and defended, swarming with surveillance on the surface and teeming with mines and nets underwater. The frogmen would have to elude all obstacles, make it to the ships, plant the explosives, and escape without being detected. The 3 targeted ships, HMS Valiant, HMS Queen Elizabeth, and the carrier HMS Eagle, would then be rattled to their core as the explosive charges tore massive holes under their hulls, sinking them to the bottom of the bay in minutes. However, plans seldom work as intended. Although they didn't know it then, the Italian frogmen were against a much more difficult trial than what they were expecting. Admiral Andrew Cunningham knew that his fleet had been weakening and would now be a prime target for attacks and sabotage attempts. The British were also fully aware of Italian manned torpedo technology and the tactics employed by the frogmen, as they had obtained one of the torpedoes from the second Italian attack on Gibraltar and captured some men after the second attack on Malta. Cunningham knew an attack was coming, but he did not know the day, the hour, or the exact place. As such, he responded by bolstering British defenses in all Mediterranean bases, and deploying additional mines and submarine nets around the most critical ports, especially on the large military port of Alexandria. The attack finally came on December 3, 1941, when the Italian submarine Side, commanded by Lieutenant Junio Valerio Borghese, departed from the La Spezia naval base, carrying 3 manned torpedoes, known as maiali, or pigs to the Italians. The submarine secretly stopped at the island of Leros in the Aegean Sea, with the 6 hand-picked frogmen carrying out the mission got on board. After an excruciating journey, where the submarine had to travel submerged most of the way, Borghese reached his destination on the night of December 19th. The brilliant skipper had surfaced only 4 feet off his intended target position. When the sun finally came down, the captain released the manned torpedoes, each crewed by 2 frogmen. The torpedoes had been equipped with large explosive warheads, designed to be quickly placed below the hulls of capital ships. The frogmen silently slipped into the water as they had practiced so many times, making a mad dash across the water and towards the harbor. As the frogmen drew increasingly closer to their targets, they had to carefully navigate through a vast field of mines and submarine nets resting in the waters around the port of Alexandria. Despite working in nearly complete darkness, the commandos were able to get to the entrance of the harbor, where the defenses were almost impassable. In a fortunate turn of events, the British suddenly lowered the defenses as 3 destroyers were returning to port at that very moment. The frogmen took advantage of the situation and entered the harbor alongside the British vessels. So close were they to the enemy vessels that they could hear the sailors' conversations on deck. The leading torpedo, headed for HMS Valiant, was now inside the harbor. The 2 crewmen carefully advanced, frequently stopping to push their torpedo over the submarine nets that continued to protect the inside of the dock. The second pair of frogmen, targeting HMS Elizabeth, approached their target without meeting any resistance. They quickly identified the massive battleship silhouette against the harbor's light. The last pair, tasked with sinking the British carrier HMS Eagle, was met with an insurmountable issue. The ship was not there. The carrier had actually been deployed to the Indian Sea that morning, and the commandos would have to find another objective. With several cruisers discarded as too small, the frogmen finally decided to plant their warhead on the hull of a large tanker moored at the docks. While this was taking place, the pair attacking Valiant was suddenly struck by disaster. Their manned torpedo's propeller was damaged by the steel cable of a submarine net, and its engine was now useless. They were just a few dozen yards from their objective, but they could not move the warhead. Both men dove 55 feet to the seabed, where they began to slowly push the broken torpedo towards Valiant. But suddenly, the breathing equipment of one of the commandos stopped working, forcing him to surface immediately. Luigi Duran de la Pena had to push the torpedo for a grueling 40 minutes in pitch-black darkness, while his mask filled with water and his breathing gear gave him vicious stomach spasms. However, he was able to place the torpedo in the seabed below the Valiant's hull, and although it was not attached to the ship, it would have to do. The events that followed were chaotic and intense. As De La Pena surfaced and met with his cohort, they were suddenly spotted by a searchlight, and the fierce warning burst of a machine gun forced them to surrender. They were immediately taken prisoners. The team targeting Queen Elizabeth managed to reach the shore and escape into town. However, they were captured a few hours later by Egyptian customs officers and were turned in to the British authorities. As De La Pena and his teammate began to be interrogated at 6 a.m., the first charge detonated in a deafening roar that swallowed the massive tanker and a destroyer that had been refueling. The British tried to force the captured men to reveal the location of the other explosives, but the Italian commandos would not budge. As the interrogation continued, groups of Italian men desperately searched the 2 battleships. However, the efforts were futile. At 6:04 a.m., Valiant detonated. Her structure shattered, and her decks flooded rapidly. Then, at precisely 6:15, a colossal blast tore apart the hull of HMS Queen Elizabeth, smashing 3 of her boiler compartments into pieces. The captured commandos looked at each other with pride. Despite being prisoners, they had achieved their objective and crippled the Mediterranean fleet. Meanwhile, the last pair of commandos had managed to escape the harbor, but were caught the following day. All 6 frogmen were now in British custody, but the deed could not be undone. The Italian Navy had achieved a remarkable feat. They had sunk a significant oil tanker, caused damage to a destroyer, and taken 2 capital ships out of commission for months. This stunning victory had an immense impact, completely changing the naval balance of power in the Mediterranean. On April 6, 1945, the world's heaviest and most powerful battleship ever assembled set sail from the Yamaguchi Prefecture in Japan for a one-way mission to Okinawa. The U.S. Army and Marines had just landed on the island, the last Japanese line of defense before the Allied invasion of mainland Japan. With the Imperial Army and Navy lacking the men and resources to resist, Yamato and her crew were ordered to support the resistance. Yamato was fully supplied with ammunition, but only carried enough fuel to arrive at her destination, and the ship's servicemen were sure they wouldn't survive. Still, Operation Tengo was the only way the Japanese had a fighting chance against the overwhelming Allied naval force. And if that meant sacrificing Yamato and all of their lives, the crew was committed to carrying on for the glory of Emperor Hirohito and the Empire of Japan. Japan's victory over the Russian fleet during the Battle of the Tsushima Strait in May of 1905 confirmed a new path for the Japanese maritime strategy. The naval officers of the rising empire believed that all future sea conflicts would invariably lead to an epic sea battle of gigantic proportions, where two opponents would commit their entire fleets for one decisive result. This Japanese doctrine was called Kantai Kessen, or Decisive Battle Doctrine. With the appearance of the first British dreadnoughts during that same year, the Japanese Navy began to study the idea of developing gigantic ships that could decide the fate of a battle if they entered combat. The first of these ambitious battleships came in 1909 and were perfected in 1916 with the Nagato, a warship armed with 10 devastating 16-inch guns, making her the largest warship of her time. However, Japan's objective of one day matching the United States Navy in quality and quantity was abruptly halted following the Treaty of Versailles and the Washington Naval Treaty. Japan's petition for the empire and its citizens to be recognized as equals to the European and American victors of World War I was rejected. Additionally, Japan's total capital ships were limited to 70% of those of the American Navy. The empire resented this injustice and left the League of Nations and the Washington Naval Treaty in 1934. With these unfair obligations out of the way, the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, set out to strengthen its fleet and secretly fulfilled its desire to build 4 super battleships, the largest the world had ever seen. Knowing full well that they could never match the economic and production capacities of the Americans, the IJN intended to shift the balance with these super battleships, which were supposed to be capable of engaging multiple enemy warships at once. The super battleships were also going to carry 16-inch main guns and thick armor that was expected to resist direct impacts from 18-inch naval artillery shells. After meticulously studying over 24 different designs, the IJN came up with a final one that called for a battleship that could carry 9 18-inch main guns, withstand the hits from hostile shells of the same caliber, and be defended by an underwater armor that could resist the damage of 660-pound torpedoes. Other specifications were to be determined later. Still, Japanese engineers realized that such a ship would require a displacement of at least 70,000 tons. In 1936, the Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi, were approved for construction, but to build these colossal ships, the IJN had to modify the dockyards at Kure and Nagasaki to adequately accommodate the gigantic hulls. Both ports had to be fitted with cranes that could lift up to 300 tons. Additionally, the dockyards were entirely concealed by other structures to hide the project's true nature and prevent the U.S. naval intelligence from collecting information about the battleships. By early 1939, as development was underway on both battleships, it was decided that a third one, Shinano, would be converted into an aircraft carrier. Then, when she was finally launched on August 8, 1940, Yamato effectively became the largest battleship ever produced in the world. More importantly, it was more powerful and heavier than her German counterpart, the Bismarck. Yamato had a length of 862 feet, a draft of 36 feet, and a beam of 127 feet, and she displaced over 72,000 tons. The colossal beast was powered by 12 compound boilers and 4 shaft-geared steam turbines. The ship boasted over 150,000 horsepower, which allowed her to reach speeds of up to 27.5 knots and an estimated range of 7,146 miles. Almost one-third of Yamato's total weight was her armor. The central armor belt was 16 inches thick, the citadel was 14 inches, the lower armor belt was between 11 and 8 inches thick, and the deck armor was between 7 and 9 inches. The 3 main turrets were protected at the front by armor that was over 26 inches thick, while the conning tower was covered by over 19.7 inches of armor. Yamato was practically impregnable from all sides, and her main armament consisted of 9 18-inch naval guns, making them the largest caliber guns ever fielded on a vessel. Each gun was over 69 feet long and weighed over 162 tons. The shells fired from these powerful guns had an approximate weight of 3,129 pounds and had a fire rate of little more than a minute. Muzzle speed was 2,600 feet per second, and the maximum range was 26 miles. Secondary armament comprised 12 6.1-inch guns mounted in 4 triple turrets, and this immense firepower was also complemented by an additional 12 5-inch guns. In addition, Yamato was fitted with 24 25mm guns and 4 13.2mm machine guns to use against hostile aircraft. More than 3,200 men were required to properly operate the massive ship. Finally, Yamato could carry 7 Nakajima E-8N or E-4N seaplanes that could be launched from 2 catapults and used for reconnaissance missions. Yamato finished sea trials in November of 1941, and by February, she became the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet. However, Yamato did not fire a single shot during the Battle of Midway, and was only used as the headquarters of the entire fleet. The ship would not see action until June of 1944, during the American advance towards the Philippines, when Yamato and her sister ship joined the combined fleet to attempt to stop the U.S. Navy's advance. At Leyte Island, the Japanese Navy sought to destroy the Americans in one decisive battle, but things quickly went wrong. The Japanese task forces were ambushed by submarines and an overwhelming number of American aircraft. During the battle, Musashi was terminated by torpedoes, and Admiral Kurita, who was leading the task force, decided to retreat before losing Yamato. Despite firing several times, the Japanese battleship did not score any objectives and was hit by 3 bombs, causing intermediate damage. Yamato remained at Kure from November of 1944 to April of 1945 until she was fully repaired. By then, the Americans had launched the invasion of Okinawa, and many men from the Japanese High Command were convinced that the war was lost. Still, the Japanese fighting spirit lingered on, and the IJN wanted to go down fighting like the samurai, honoring their emperor until the very end. The IJN then put together a special one-way mission, codenamed Operation Tengo, which would include Yamato and the Second Fleet. The objective was simple: to set sail straight into the American ship's formation stationed off the coasts of Okinawa. Once there, Yamato was to be grounded and fight until the last man. Yamato's crew knew they would not survive. Still, on April 6, 1945, they set sail from Japan, ready to fulfill their oath of loyalty to the Emperor. The task force was expected to reach Okinawa on April 9th, but it was intercepted 2 days earlier by American submarines, and an overwhelming battle ensued. The Japanese fought with all their might. One by one, Yamato's escorts began to go down after multiple torpedo hits and bomb impacts from U.S. Navy aircraft. When they were all gone, the American aircraft turned towards Yamato. The ship fired non-stop in return until the gun's barrels were too hot or simply stopped firing as the men were taken down by the American bombs. After 2 hours of intense combat, Yamato couldn't take it any longer. The colossal battleship had been hit with all sorts of bombs, from armor-piercing to high-explosive ones, as the U.S. pilots tried to maximize the damage. Soon, the fires engulfing Yamato's deck became uncontrollable. Once the Japanese anti-aircraft guns went completely silent, the American aircraft began to drop bombs and torpedoes from low altitudes. After 11 torpedo hits, the order to abandon the ship was given. Yamato quickly sank, and only less than 300 crewmen made it out alive from the remains of the world's largest battleship. Still, the legacy of Yamato endures almost 100 years later. In Japan, the Yamato Museum at Kure, where the ship had been initially built, features an incredible and highly detailed 1/10 scale model. In the turbulent waters of the Indian Ocean, by March 1942, the Allies' time was rapidly running out. The Battle of the Java Sea had ended in disaster, and now, as the Imperial Japanese Navy continued its trail of destruction, the tiny Australian sloop HMAS Yarra was tasked with escorting a convoy consisting of 3 of the last few British vessels left in the region through the danger zone to the safety of Fremantle, Australia. As dawn broke on March 4th, Yarra's lookout made a horrifying discovery: the topmasts of 3 enormous Japanese heavy cruisers bearing down on them, accompanied by 4 destroyers. Under the command of the ruthless Admiral Nobutaka Kondo, the enemy fleet towered over the humble sloop in number, size, firepower, range, and speed. As the alarm bells rang out on board Yarra, Lieutenant Commander Robert Rankin knew the odds of making it out alive were almost 0. But the sloop had a convoy to protect, and it wasn't going to go down without a fight. Named after the River Yarra in Victoria, Australia, HMAS Yarra was one of 13 Grimsby-class sloops developed in the early 1930s for convoy escort roles. By 1932, the idea of integrating escort and minesweeping duties was abandoned, leading to the creation of the Grimsby-class sloops. Starting in 1933, 8 were constructed for the Royal Navy. In 1934, the Royal Australian Navy began building its own, with Yarra being the first, laid down by the Cockatoo Island Dockyard in Sydney on May 24, 1934. Sloops were among the smallest warships of their day, and Yarra was no exception. She had a displacement of 1,060 tons at standard load, increasing to 1,500 tons when fully loaded. She measured 266 feet 3 inches in length, with a beam of 36 feet and a draft ranging from 7.5 to 10 feet, depending on the load. However, despite her modest size, she had a relatively powerful propulsion system. In peacetime, Yarra was crewed by 135 officers and sailors, but this would rise to 160 in wartime. When it came to armament, Yarra mostly relied on her trio of QF 4-inch Mark V anti-aircraft guns, which had a reasonably rapid rate of fire and an effective range, providing her the ability to defend herself from both aerial and surface attacks. She was also armed with a quadruple machine gun mount for short-range engagements. While her first few years principally consisted of routine patrols and training exercises, when Australia followed Britain into World War II in September 1939, Yarra would soon find herself performing an important role. Although the Grimsby class had not initially been designed as a minesweeper, in December of that year, Yarra joined the newly formed 20th Minesweeping Flotilla alongside HMAS Swan, Dumba, and Aurora. Based at Port Melbourne, the 4 ships were given the crucial but high-risk task of scouring Australian waters for enemy mines, keeping sea lanes open for merchant shipping and troop convoys. In August 1940, the waters off the coast of East Africa and the southern Arabian Peninsula were quickly becoming a hotspot for violent clashes as British and Italian colonies brushed up against each other, and Yarra reinforced Allied convoy operations in the area as part of the Royal Navy's Red Sea Force. Under Lieutenant Commander W.H. Harrington, she set sail from Fremantle, arriving in Aden on September 18th. It wouldn't take long for Yarra's crew to realize they were now on the front lines of World War II, as that same night she was subjected to not 1 but 2 Italian air raids. While the diminutive warship survived the attacks unscathed, this baptism of fire would give her a taste of what was to come. 1 month later, on the evening of October 20th, Yarra escorted convoy BNT north from Aden. Positioned to starboard, Yarra zigzagged through the waters, a tactical maneuver designed to make her a harder target for enemy submarines and torpedoes. Around 11 p.m., a few miles east of Massawa, the tranquility was shattered as 2 ships were spotted approaching at high speed. Yarra's lookout sighted the vessels and sounded the alarm. The crew sprang into action, hearts pounding with the adrenaline of the moment. Yarra's commander issued a challenge, the signal lights blinking rapidly. The enemy wouldn't take long to reveal themselves. Suddenly, one of the vessels blasted a torpedo in the Australian sloop's direction. Yarra's crew narrowly evaded the hit before skillfully dodging a second torpedo attack. The thunderous roar of the Italian warship's guns swiftly followed the torpedoes. HMS Auckland, another sloop in the convoy, was the first to return fire. Moments later, Yarra followed with a salvo. Caught off guard by the response, the enemy ships turned away, trying to escape while the Allies followed in hot pursuit. Soon enough, the British cruiser HMS Lender and destroyer HMS Kimberley joined the chase. Determined not to let the enemy escape, Kimberley drove the Italian destroyer Francesco Nullo ashore on a small island off Massawa and knocked her out with a perfectly aimed torpedo. In her first naval skirmish, the small but mighty Yarra had played a key role and gained valuable experience that would later prove vital. By spring 1941, the conflict in the Red Sea was drawing to a close, with the Italians losing their grip on the region. Yarra headed for refitting in Bombay, completed on April 9th, a day after the British captured Massawa, ending Italian rule in Eritrea as well as fighting in the Red Sea. 3 days later, Yarra was needed on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. In Iraq, Germany and Italy had orchestrated the Golden Square coup, replacing the pro-British leadership with Axis-friendly Arab nationalists. As British forces poured into Iraq, tensions escalated. On May 2nd, the new Iraqi government declared war on Britain and attacked British establishments. That same day, Iraqi forces attempted to destroy a bridge over the Karmat Ali River, but failed due to faulty explosives. Lieutenant Commander Harrington, upon learning of the failed demolition, quickly deployed Yarra's gunner to secure the bridge, achieving a strategic victory for the British. Later that month, HMAS Yarra took part in a daring plan to disperse enemy forces entrenched along the Shatt al-Arab, 7 miles from Ashar. On the night of May 22nd, 6 sailors from Yarra, disguised as Arabs, conducted a covert reconnaissance mission. They quietly navigated the waters in native craft, taking soundings to ensure the safety of the upcoming landing. Their subterfuge succeeded, and they relayed the critical information back to Lieutenant Commander Harrington. The following night, under darkness, a flotilla consisting of Yarra, 2 tugs, and 2 native craft set out for the landing point. By 4 a.m. on May 24th, they were in position. Yarra bombarded the shoreline, creating a smokescreen before landing a unit of Indian soldiers. As the troops emerged, Yarra's guns roared in support. The battle was intense but swift, ending by 8 a.m. The enemy was routed, their positions burning as the flotilla returned downstream. Thanks to the efforts of the tiny warship, the operation was a success, and less than a week later, the war in Iraq ended with the pro-British government reinstalled. However, as one Middle Eastern crisis ended, a new one emerged in neighboring Iran, a crucial supply line between the British and the Soviet Union. With German forces advancing toward the Caucasus and increasing Nazi influence in Iran, the Allies decided to intervene, and Yarra would play a key role. In the early hours of August 25, 1941, as the Soviets prepared to invade Iran from the north, the British launched their attack from the Persian Gulf. Yarra, along with HMS Falmouth, a tug, and a launch, was tasked with neutralizing the enemy naval base at Khorramshahr, which housed the Iranian sloop Babur, 2 gunboats, and around 1,000 Iranian troops. Simultaneous attacks were planned for Bandar Shapur and Abadan. At 1 a.m., Yarra, carrying a platoon of Indian infantry, departed from her anchorage in the Shatt al-Arab near Basra. Falmouth was to follow with 2 more platoons, but ran aground as she maneuvered into position. Yarra pressed on, hoping the rising tide would free her fellow sloop. The darkness was oppressive, the heat almost unbearable, and the silence so profound that Lieutenant Commander Harrington would later say, quote, "Every sound seemed like a thunderclap." Blacked out to avoid detection, the vessels moved stealthily downstream, miraculously passing unnoticed by Iranian strongposts along the Shatt al-Arab. At 4:08 a.m., Yarra furtively arrived off the naval base and hid behind an anchored merchant ship. Moments later, the stillness was shattered by gunfire downstream, signaling the commencement of operations at Abadan. Harrington skillfully navigated Yarra into the stream, past the northern point of the Karen River mouth. Searchlights blazed, illuminating the target, and Yarra's guns roared to life. The Babur offered no retaliation. Within 10 salvos, it was engulfed in flames. An explosion from the aft magazine tore a hole in the vessel, sinking it. With 1 enemy vessel destroyed, Yarra pressed into the Karen River to confront Iranian gunboats. Sporadic fire from the naval barracks was silenced by Yarra's machine guns and a single round from a 3-pounder. As Yarra closed in on the gunboats, initial rifle fire ceased under her machine gun's relentless sweep. Drawing alongside, Yarra faced only a few stray bullets before boarding parties of gunners, cooks, and stewards boarded the gunboats. They found the Iranian crews hiding below decks. A few warning shots down the hatches brought the enemy sailors out, ready to surrender. Meanwhile, Harrington received word that Falmouth had freed herself from grounding. Deciding to wait for reinforcements before landing his platoon, he anchored Yarra and kept a watchful silence, holding 90 Iranian and Italian prisoners securely on board. At 5:30 a.m., the calm was broken by Falmouth's arrival. She pulled alongside the Iranian depot ship Ivy before landing her troops. Onshore fighting continued, but by 10 a.m., the entire barracks area was under British control. Yarra then transferred her prisoners to Ivy, keeping a few Italian engineers to work on the captured gunboats. By the end of the day, Khorramshahr was completely captured. On September 2nd, in no small part due to the success of Yarra's missions, the Italian government accepted British-Soviet terms, with the pro-German Shah abdicating 2 weeks later. For his efforts, Harrington earned the Distinguished Service Order. Next, Yarra was sent to the Mediterranean for escort duties between Alexandria and Tobruk. She faced intense low-level attacks from the Luftwaffe, much more effective than the Italian high-level bombing she was used to. On December 7, 1941, the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, Yarra was raided by 35 enemy aircraft, including dive bombers. Miraculously, none hit Yarra, and she escaped with only minor damage from near misses. With the Pacific War underway, Yarra moved to escort duties from Sunda Strait to Singapore. On February 3, 1942, she escorted 5 ships with HMS Dene and HMAS Sutlej. Attempting to enter Singapore by day, the convoy was attacked by Japanese dive bombers. Transports Felix Roussel and Empress of Asia were hit. While Felix Roussel controlled the flames, Empress of Asia was engulfed. Yarra valiantly defended the convoy, downing at least one enemy aircraft. Harrington maneuvered Yarra to Empress of Asia's stern, rescuing 1,804 men amid enemy fire, solidifying the sloop's reputation for heroism. In the following weeks, Yarra continued escort duties, with Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Rankin taking over from Harrington. The situation for the Allies deteriorated rapidly. On February 27th, the Japanese attacked the Allied fleet in the Battle of the Java Sea, sinking several warships and causing heavy casualties. As the Japanese onslaught continued, it became clear that withdrawal was the only option. The British hurried the remaining ships out of Batavia to Jellit Chop. However, as they neared the port on March 2nd, they received a signal to avoid the harbor, and Yarra escorted the convoy to Fremantle. A Japanese cruiser force, led by Admiral Kondo, was sweeping the Indian Ocean, hunting the remnants of Allied naval power in the Dutch East Indies. They had already sunk several ships, including the British destroyer HMS Stronghold, and now headed toward the convoy. At 6:30 a.m., Yarra's lookout spotted the topmasts of the heavy cruisers Otago, Takao, and Maya to the north-northeast, with 4 destroyers alongside them. Lieutenant Commander Rankin gave the order to scatter. Despite being outgunned, Yarra's 3 4-inch guns opened fire, laying down a smokescreen to cover the convoy's escape. The enemy proved too powerful, and the convoy's ships began to fall. On King sank first, followed by the motor minesweeper, which was hit by close-range fire from one of the cruisers. Yarra was ablaze and tilting heavily, but she fought on to protect the tanker Francoul, which eventually succumbed at 7:30 a.m., leaving Yarra alone. For another half hour, Yarra's guns roared, until just after 8 a.m., Rankin ordered the crew to abandon ship. The bridge was struck by an 8-inch salvo, and Rankin was lost. The survivors hurried into rafts as Japanese destroyers pounded Yarra until she sank. Of the 151 crew members on Yarra, 138, including the captain and all officers, either perished in the battle or later due to injury, thirst, exposure, or shark attacks. Only 13 men survived. Yarra's wartime service earned 2 battle honors, Libya 1941 and East Indies 1942. In 2000, a memorial to HMAS Yarra was opened at Newport Park in Melbourne. In March 2013, Governor General Quentin Bryce announced a unit citation for gallantry for the ship's company at the time of its sinking. This award was presented on March 4, 2014, the anniversary of Yarra's loss, to the Chief of Navy and the crew of the modern-day HMAS Yarra in a solemn ceremony on the River Yarra.